Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 366. This week we have quite a lot of videos for questions. We have Guide 433 on the Type 14 Milku U-Boat, the April 1st video on the SS Great Eastern HMS Leviathan, the Wednesday video on the Dunkerque class, and then the Friday video on shipwreck salvage and the Isle of Wight Museum. Almirante Brown asks, how would you build a steam-electric submarine like the K-class during the second half of the 19th century, using cutting-edge but existing technologies and materials of the time, even if the cost of said submarine would rule out serial production? Honestly, I don't think it's actually possible, because if you're looking at the 19th as opposed to the 20th century, you don't have access to steam turbines, so that means you're going to have to use vertical triple expansion engines. They are much, much larger affairs, and, well, try building a pressure hull that's going to get you much more than 10 feet down that can accommodate a appropriately sized vertical triple expansion engine. That's going to be a really, really big ask. Plus, of course, as mentioned before, the vertical triple expansion engines at the time, they have issues with vibration, they have issues with oil and steam being sprayed out everywhere. That's not good on a submarine, especially being the 19th century. It's going to be a riveted submarine. An engine that's going to be constantly vibrating in a very confined environment, you may well be inducing leaks. And then you also have the batteries. Now, granted, battery technology does exist in the late 19th century, and even rechargeable battery technology exists for most of the late 19th century, but the energy density of those batteries is going to be somewhat lower. That's one of the advances you see during World War I, the interwar period, World War II, and then immediately thereafter. You get more and more capable batteries in smaller and smaller containers, and thus improving both underwater power and endurance. But obviously trace that backwards, and, well, in the late 19th century, you're not going to have particularly energy-dense rechargeable batteries, which means you're not going to go very far underwater anyway, and not particularly quickly, with your gigantic VTE-holding submarine. So trying to make a K-class in that time period as a submarine or a submersible, I just don't think you could do it. I think there may be some percentage in making a semi-submersible cruiser-size vessel of something like that. You could possibly pull that off and maybe even get it fully submerged, but that's about as far as I think you could go. You're not going to really be going much more than just under the surface, and even then, it's going to be fun trying to, make all of that watertight and stop the engines, etc., etc. Basically, all the problems that the K-class had ramped up to 11. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, did the United States ever think about building a milk cow-type submarine for their own forces in the Pacific? How useful would such a submarine have been, especially if it had been built either early in the war or pre-war? For example, could it have made the S-boats with their actually functioning Mark 10s a somewhat greater threat? As far as I'm aware, the idea of a long-range supply sub for the US submarine forces never seems to have crossed the US Navy's desk. And there's a few good reasons for that. Firstly, while the S-class didn't have the world's greatest range, obviously it depends on exactly which group or batch number you're looking at, but they all are significantly outranged by the Gato class to varying degrees. The range of the various S-class batches is actually broadly comparable with the range of the A, B, and C, and various C iteration models of Type 7 U-boat. So they're not massively short-legged. And also in the very earliest period of the war, when the S-class really were seeing the bulk of their frontline service, and of course the Mark 10 torpedoes had an advantage over the Mark 14, the simple fact was that the Japanese forces were kind of up and in your face, and the fact that you didn't have a 10,000 plus nautical mile range really didn't matter, because you didn't have to go anywhere near that far to find Japanese ships. And therefore a milk cow type submarine wouldn't have been particularly useful, especially because One of the things that the milk cows exploited was the mid-Atlantic air gap, and with all the little islands and the constantly shifting front lines in Southeast Asia around the time, as I said, when the S-class would be the most useful, there's a lot of Japanese shipping and air patrols going out. So that there isn't really an air gap. There's just, is there Japanese patrols over this area? So they would have actually been at somewhat of a disadvantage compared to the German submarines. And the larger factors as to why the US never really seems to have considered such a sub are twofold in a way. One, whether the US subs are sailing from Pearl or from some small island base or from Australia, the simple fact is their initial sailing is safe. And things get progressively more and more dangerous the closer and closer they get to Japanese-held territory. Well, that seems obvious, but remember that the U-boats in the Battle of the Atlantic initially, before the fall of France, have to get past the UK, either through the Channel or round the top via the North Sea. And then even once they've captured the western coast of France, they still have to cross the Bay of Biscay, where there's various Allied patrols, aircraft, sloops, that kind of thing. So unlike the US, the Germans actually have to worry about every time they're coming to and from their bases, there is a strong possibility they may be attacked or sunk. The Americans don't have that risk, therefore shuttling back and forth to their bases is a lot less risky, because once they've broken contact with the enemy, they don't have to worry about the enemy. Whereas for a U-boat, you can break contact with the convoys, but there's still 2 or 3 points along your route home where you might be attacked or run into mines and stuff. And the other factor, which we kind of hinted at just a minute ago, is the operating environment. With the milk cows, you need some calm, relatively, not abandoned, but relatively unpatrolled waters in order to pull off a resupply mission, because you're going to be up and around on the surface for quite a while. For US subs, even before they contemplate the fleet boats, and obviously once they start building the fleet boats, they've got the range anyway, they don't need to worry about that so much. And bear in mind, fleet boats start before the Gatos, but even if you were looking purely at an S-class scenario, the simple fact is, without a mid-Atlantic air gap equivalent, finding somewhere to do the resupply is going to be somewhat more difficult, somewhat more risky. Now, you could argue, well, maybe you could have the milk cow equivalent station just outside the enemy zone of control and refuel and rearm from there. Well, yes, you could, but the simple fact is that by the time you've left the Japanese-held zones, especially in the early part of the war, you're only a few days sailing from home anyway. If that, you might even be less than that, depending on where exactly you're going. So the difficulty of doing a partial resupply at sea from some submarines, really, the cost and the difficulty doesn't add up compared to just that little bit of extra to go home, where you can resupply and refuel much more easily at much less cost to the Navy. Your men can have R&R, you can file reports, etc., etc. Or to be perfectly honest, once outside the enemy zone of control, you might as well use a submarine tender or something like that. Scott Mason asks, my nephew asked me a question that I couldn't answer, but I thought maybe you could help. He asked me, did any large warships ever disappear without a trace? All that I could think of were Surcouf and other submarines, as well as HMS Sydney, but other than that I drew a blank. So were there any others that disappeared without a trace during the time period that you cover? Well, yeah, submarines are the most obvious candidates for vanishing without a trace, but there is quite a disturbingly long list of large warships that have just disappeared off the face of the earth. So, technically speaking, since they do carry the prefix USS, you have, of course, the USS Cyclops, famously beloved of conspiracy theorists, but also, interestingly, of her class of 4 colliers, all 3 that remained as colliers all vanished without a trace, which perhaps indicates there was something wrong with the class, or indeed, in fact, their cargo, as I've discussed previously. The other one, in case you're interested, was turned into USS Langley, which the Japanese managed to sink, but that's neither here nor there. Once you get into the 20th century, large warships vanishing without a trace is very, very uncommon, unless they're a sub, mostly because of the invention of radio. Even if a ship has been massively overwhelmed and is sinking very rapidly, they'll usually get some kind of distress call out. Or, if they've been sunk in times of war, then between large crews, meaning possibly someone will survive, and or the enemy, either the enemy broadcasting that, hey, we sunk this thing, or later on you find out from the enemy what's happened, we now know what happened to those ships. So there are some ships that at the time, everyone was like, oh, wonder where they've gone. Vanished, no survivors. But then weeks, months, or possibly even a few years later, their fate was discovered, and now we know what happened. But dial the clock back even just 1 century to the 19th century, and actually warships vanishing, while not common, wasn't unheard of. During the non-Napoleonic War period, you're looking at a large warship vanishing every 15 to 20 years, which obviously would cause great concern and confusion. For example, the frigate HMS Atlanta, which was acting as a training ship in the late 19th century, vanished off the face of the planet. No one knew where the heck it had gone. Still don't, for that matter. The Japanese also lost a protected cruiser, a brand new one actually, built in France. It was on its delivery voyage when it vanished into the middle of nowhere, somewhere in the South China Sea. About a decade later, they found that some wreckage had washed up on one of the nearby islands, but they still didn't find the wreck. And during the Napoleonic Wars, a large warship went missing on average roughly every year or two. And by a large warship, I mean something that was actually a commissioned ship. A lot of them were cutters and schooners and things like that, a few frigates and so forth. But obviously with a lot more warships operating in the sort of 1790s and 1800s and early 1810s, plus a lot of them obviously potentially being battle damaged, unsurprisingly, ships just vanishing off the face of the planet was somewhat more common. Unicorns and Unions asks, why did you fail to mention the 1976 refit of HMS Leviathan when her boilers were replaced with nuclear reactors and her air group changed to 40 Harriers and 20 Sea Kings? Well, I wanted to give the old girl a retirement that was roughly commensurate with the period that the channel coverage ended. But, much as obviously the whole April 1st thing with HMS Leviathan was a joke, the slightly amusing part about it is that the Great Eastern, aka HMS Leviathan, was actually marginally longer than an Invincible-class aircraft carrier. And so, theoretically, had it existed, then, obviously its hull form would be far less efficient than the Invincible class. But in terms of, its last theoretical stage being a carrier, it could have carried a reasonable complement as compared to an Invincible-class light aircraft carrier. So theoretically, if you had refitted it in the 70s, it could have seen service in the Cold War. Although an air group of 80 would be perhaps a little bit too ambitious, she certainly could have carried a large number of helicopters and or Harriers. Look at how many they managed to fit on Invincible herself during the Falklands. Although given her limited speed, I would actually say perhaps she would have made a better assault ship. So perhaps replacing the Centaur and thus becoming probably the landing group flagship, then being accompanied by Fearless and Intrepid, at which point she would have probably been wielding a whole ton of helicopters more so than Harriers. The interesting thing, of course, is that if they had dragged her out for retirement and polished up the guns, maybe stuck a new radar or whatever on her, then she may well actually have been one of the most effective anti-aircraft vessels in San Carlos water, simply by having a whole ton of radar-directed anti-aircraft guns, obviously in an environment where the missiles weren't helping all that much. Kim Raudenbush asks, Drac, would anything from HMS Leviathan - Great Eastern have actually been possible? Maybe not fitting 142 guns, but could she have made a practical warship? In terms of could she have been converted into a warship, absolutely yes. That would have been possible. It's Brunel. She's got more than enough structural strength to her. And the funny thing is that although 142 guns sounds a bit, silly, the simple fact is that I took the principles of design as you find in HMS Warrior and the French double-decker, for obvious reasons, Magenta, and simply applied them to a hull the size of Great Eastern. Now, so you could actually make, a 142-gun ironclad out of her. Would it be practical? Absolutely not. It would be insane. So you would, if you were going to do it, probably use a much smaller number of guns. But there's nothing practically stopping you other than cost. And that would have been the single biggest issue for the Royal Navy trying to keep HMS Leviathan in service. She's just so big a ship. Her maintenance, upkeep, refits, etc. are just going to cost an absolute fortune. But her sheer size makes her a very useful test bed, and you can afford to do inefficient refits because she has the whole volume to absorb them. So, short version, yes, she could practically have been made into a warship, and she certainly could have had her uses, but the Royal Navy could build far more smaller warships, which could go more places and individually cost a lot less to run, for the same price as refitting and operating the Leviathan. So unless they do something like get themselves caught in a prestige loop, which is what happens in the April Fool's video, where basically they go, okay, well, we've got this big warship. It is by far and away the biggest and most powerful warship in the world. Us decommissioning it diminishes us, and we don't want to be diminished. Therefore, we'll keep it in service no matter how much it costs. That's pretty much the only way something like this is going to stay in service for that long. Although, if it does get to the sort of 1910s period, the carrier conversion of it, if you have a hull that size, is actually probably the most plausible part. Vintage Car History asks, regarding the German submarine that was impaled on Leviathan's bow, was the submarine subsequently studied and or returned to service in the Royal Navy? And did any of the German sailors write biographies about their experiences as unexpected passengers for Leviathan's voyage? So I don't think I got that far along in the detailed development of the poor old sub, but having thought about it a little since I read this question, I think there isn't really much chance of the sub being returned to service in the Royal Navy, because the poor thing's going to basically be wrapped around the ram bow. The amount of structural damage and warping that's occurred, it would be completely impractical to repair the thing and put it back into service. You might as well just build a brand new sub. Might as well just copy what you've got, obviously not bent in half. But yes, the technology would be very valuable to study, because hey, you've got a hold of a German submarine. And in the theoretical setup where this happens, basically what's occurred is the ram bows punch through the middle portion of the sub, but because you've got the ram bow stuck in the sub, leaks are relatively slow, as opposed to having a great hole in the side, which would have given most of the crew a chance to evacuate either to the bow or stern part of the sub and close up the watertight bulkheads. So that would explain why there are still surviving crew, because they're in watertight areas. The middle part is flooded, but the middle part also has Leviathan's bow stuck through it, so that's neither here nor there. And kind of inspired by what happened with the K-class submarine that ended up at the bottom of a lock for a while, I justified the crew still having an air supply by the time the Leviathan's crew noticed what happened, the same way that the K-class did things, which was that rather than using the compressed air canisters that they have, obviously, for flotation to try and float the sub to blow the ballast tanks, they instead vent the compressed air, which obviously has unused oxygen in it, into the sub as they get more and more lightheaded. So that just about keeps them alive. I would anticipate that one or two German sailors probably did write little short biographies detailing their little joyride outboard of Leviathan. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, I was recently watching a video by History Matters in which he states that the reason the Monroe Doctrine worked, despite the US Navy's small size, was the fact that it had all but Britain's signature on it. However, if for whatever reason in an alternate timeline the US isn't able to guarantee the Royal Navy will back them up, how much of an expansion to their fleet is going to be required to be able to enforce the Monroe Doctrine? Yeah, that's pretty much the Monroe Doctrine in a nutshell for most of its existence. This cartoon pretty much sums it up. Now, The US would eventually be able to enforce the Monroe Doctrine itself, starting pretty much at the very, very end of the 19th, going into the 20th century. The Spanish-American War being an example of that. But even then, I don't think the US could have enforced the Monroe Doctrine at that point against one of the bigger European navies. So you're probably looking at maybe the late 1900s, early 1910s, when the US fully becomes able to enforce the Monroe Doctrine on its own. Now, the reason, briefly, just before we go into the rest of the question, why Britain was so happy to enforce the Monroe Doctrine kind of almost on behalf of the US was because it also served the UK's interests. Britain pretty much had everything they wanted in the Americas already in the form of colonies, places like Jamaica and a couple of small holdings on the South American continent, various other islands in the Caribbean. They didn't have all that much interest anymore as of the 1820s and onwards in taking anyone else's colonies, at least in that area. But they also had an interest in keeping the whole area calm without everything changing hands every 5 minutes, because that facilitated trade, and trade was fundamentally what the British Empire was built around. What manner of trade is another matter, but essentially, if you wanted an absolute simplistic version, the British Empire was founded mostly just to facilitate trade without people interfering with them. And so a stable Central and South America where everybody knew who owned what and who could trade with what trade goods were available, this was good for the British. So if the Americans said, we don't want anyone else to interfere with political affairs over on this side of things, the British mostly was like, yeah, that sounds fair. We're going to enforce that because it's good for us. And, well, if we decide we do want to interfere, the American fleet isn't really in a shape or size to be able to stop us, so that doesn't really concern us either. Of course, that meant that the Monroe Doctrine was only enforced as far as Britain actually cared as to what was going on. So, for example, when the French rock up in Mexico, the British do not care one bit what happens there, and the US isn't in a position to stop the French, which is quite an amusing little sideshow in 19th century history. So what you have to do to determine what size of fleet would the US need to enforce the Monroe Doctrine is to look at what attempts were there to break the Monroe Doctrine and scale your fleet to that. So you're going to need a fleet that, at least in the latter part of the 19th century, is going to be big enough to, send the various South American navies away from trying to interfere with things. So you are going to need a few ironclads in that period at least. And the French intervention in Mexico probably being one of the largest fleet movements there in the 19th century, or at least the bulk of it, you're probably looking at a fleet that could deter a French expeditionary force that's going transatlantic, which would require a reasonable-sized force because, of course, at this point the French are the second largest fleet on the planet. Now, granted, they're not going to be able to deploy their full force over to the other side of the Atlantic, but they can send a pretty powerful squadron, so you're probably going to need at least half a dozen big ships of the line, USS Pennsylvania style, presumably modernized, probably backed up by twice that many heavy frigates as your Age of Sail component. Obviously then modernize them with steam, and then going into the ironclad era, you're probably going to need, again, about half a dozen good-sized ironclads and about double that number of smaller vessels. That, I would say, would be about the smallest fleet size you'd need to actually properly enforce the Monroe Doctrine, and you probably don't want to go much above that, because if you do go much above that, it becomes less and less of an enforcement fleet that's got more of a passive role and more looks like an active fleet that might come and try and interfere elsewhere, at which point you start drawing the ire of rather large navies who may take objection to that. Spitezor asks, your comment about France's lack of natural locations for docks begs the question, just how does Britain compare in terms of natural features for such facilities? And entirely speculatively, how would Britain's history and maritime empire look had it been similarly limited or lacked natural harbours in the way that Italy does? Britain, especially for its size, has an unusually high number of ports, harbours, bays, or other geographical features that would be useful as such. And that's mostly to do with the geology. So the UK is in this weird position where, compared to France, or compared to the French coast generally, the UK's coastline is a lot more jagged if you look on a map. So you look at France's coastline, there's lots of long sweeping areas, and that's actually not particularly good for ports, because obviously you need discontinuity in the landscape to form harbours and bays and so forth. But at the same time, you don't want it to go too far, because if you go too far, you end up like Norway with long, deep fjords, which are great, except for obviously there's a lot fewer of them relative to the number of small ports and bays and harbours that you can get in the UK. And the geology is also why, to a certain extent, the French Channel coast is actually relatively good for ports, the same way as the British Channel coast is, but the French Atlantic coast is not so good. Now, that's not to say you don't get a fair number of reasonable ports and harbours and so forth in France. You do. It's just that per mile of coastline, their statistical occurrence is much less. But another problem that France has is that when you're looking at the main portion of the channel, with the exception of the Cherbourg Peninsula and even then the very tip of it, the deep water parts of the English Channel, or La Manche if you're French, tend to run a bit more towards the British side of things, which means there's a steeper fall off of water, which means that deep water ports and harbours are more common on the British side of things, whereas on the French side of things you can get a reasonable number of ports and harbours, but they're often surrounded by sandbanks and long deep shallows, which makes them less suitable for big heavy warships and dockyard facilities. And the final part of it is, as kind of I mentioned in the Dunkirk video, which is where this question has come from, while France does have a reasonable number of well-developed Atlantic ports, obviously in the context of facing off against the UK, there's obviously the Mediterranean ports as well, but essentially the problem that France faces is that again, thanks to geology and geography, a lot of their port facilities are relatively far into harbours or even up estuaries, sometimes even on rivers. And because that's where the shelter is, and that's where the geography provides for cities to be and everything. Now, that is fantastic when you're building smaller ships, wooden warships, for example. The width, etc., is fine. But when you get to building really big steel warships or iron warships in the ironclad era, those facilities suddenly become a lot more cramped. Whereas for the British, outside of somewhere like Chatham, the vast majority of British port facilities are much closer to the coastline, and even the ones that are in estuaries tend to be in one or two very, very large estuaries where allowance can be made for upgrading the facilities. If Britain ends up somehow lacking lots of natural harbours, way, way, way back, obviously, then obviously it does limit its development as a maritime nation on two grounds. Firstly, obviously, fewer harbours means more concentration of shipbuilding facilities. There's therefore a cap on how many ships you can build, and with the demands of merchant fleets and so forth, that limits how many warships you can build, and obviously makes those ports much easier to threaten. But the other thing is that one of the big things that helped the UK in its rise as a maritime power was the prevalence of a large population of seafarers. If your seafaring communities are limited to much fewer, potentially individually somewhat larger, but still very few ports, you don't get that depth of seafaring people around, and therefore less incentive to go out to sea in the first place, and a smaller population base that's actually trained in seafaring, which will affect the quality of the people you can put in whatever size navy you can build. Oscar Muella, I think, asks, when you talk about the bulkhead separating the quad turrets on the Dunkirk and Strasbourg, essentially making them two closely placed twin turrets, does this mean the bulkhead extends all the way along the barbette down to the magazines? I only ask because to me it would seem that a hit on the armour belt that managed to penetrate the barbette would then knock all four guns out if the bulkhead didn't extend all that way down. As far as I can tell from the diagrams available, no, the bulkhead in the turret doesn't extend down into the barbette, and that seems to be for, well, there's one obvious reason. The barbette is fixed, the turret rotates. So if you had a fixed bulkhead attached to the barbette, then the minute the turret rotated off of just pointing dead ahead, there'd be a misalignment and the hoists wouldn't work properly. There also doesn't seem to have been a continuation of the bulkhead down through the rotating part of the turret mechanism. And that's, I think, mostly on the theory that if a shell gets through the barbette, you have a lot bigger things to worry about. Because remember, the barbettes are continuously curved, so you're never going to get a perpendicular strike, or you could potentially get a perpendicular strike, but it would be very, very unlikely. And they are quite thick, obviously somewhat thicker on Strasbourg than on Dunkirk, but where they're exposed above the belt, they are of a continuous thickness, whereas on the turrets, the sides, the back, the roof, they're all thinner than the front plate, so you could potentially get penetrations through there, and although you don't get penetration from one of Hood's shells, you do get a hit to the roof of Dunkirk, which obviously knocks out the starboard side of one of the turrets. And so those lighter armours could either give way, or in the case of Hood's shell, you could get spalling, which disrupts things. Whereas, to be perfectly honest, if a shell gets through 12 or 13 and a bit inches of armour, depending on which ship you're looking at, a small bulkhead in the middle really isn't going to save you. You've got much, much bigger problems at that point. With that said, depending on the diagram you look at, and it's not helped by the fact that anything top-down tends to have a centerline line running through it as well, there does appear to have been some attempt to separate the hoists on the port and starboard hoists, or at least port and starboard when the gun's facing forward, with some kind of thin plating, but this doesn't seem to carry all the way up to the floor of the turret. Almirante Brown asks, could the Royal Navy have addressed HMS Captain's stability issues by dry docking the ship shortly after commissioning and replacing all the original mast, sails and related equipment with a pair of pole masts solely for signalling and spotting, and radically cutting down the flying bridges over the turrets? And if so, what kind of career, including modernizations, do you think she would have had in the following decades had those measures been successful? I mean, in theory, that would have helped a lot. How much it would have helped depends very much on exactly what method of capsizing you subscribe to, because the majority view is that she's just an unstable design as a whole, which I would subscribe to. There is also potentially a view which, I can in part support, that the situation wasn't helped by her having such massively strong masts, such that, where most masts would have perhaps collapsed or sails blown out, when she was caught broadside on by the wind, they didn't, and therefore they helped drag her over, which I can see as a contributing factor, but I wouldn't necessarily say was the primary factor when it comes to her loss. But yeah, if you took away these big tripod masts, then that is a fair amount of weight and a lot of topside weight obviously gone. The flying bridges above the guns, take it or leave it, thin them down maybe. Now, would that have addressed her stability problems? Somewhat. Certainly, it would have removed the mast as a contributory factor to potentially going over. But ultimately, when you look at the ship and you see that, if you like, lower deck, which is actually the main deck where all the men are at the bottom part of this picture, that's actually her freeboard. She doesn't have a lot now. Obviously, again, cutting down the flying decks and taking off the mast, that's going to raise the freeboard somewhat. But without carefully calculating it, sometimes that by reducing the draft, you can actually cause even more problems with roll. So I think she would remain an inherently unpleasant ship to be on in rough seas, and that low freeboard is going to cause problems once water starts coming up over it and you get a free surface effect. But it certainly would make her considerably more stable. The big problem, of course, being that in her time period, steam engines are very much an auxiliary, so she would no longer be an ocean-going ironclad. She would only be a coastal-short-range ironclad, suitable for defending the North Sea and the Channel and so forth, but not capable of deploying with the battle fleet anywhere else. As matters would have it, in the 1860s and 1870s, for the most part, that doesn't actually matter all that much to her career. But ultimately, you've turned her into a sort of slightly more sea-capable harbour defence monitor. And if you want that, well, HMVS Cerberus's design actually predates Captain by a couple of years, and is considerably more stable, better for harbour defence, similarly protected. Now, granted, Cerberus carries 10-inch rather than 12-inch guns, but Captain outmasses her by a factor of just over 2. So, at that point, I think she'd have a relatively short career, maybe going off to be a training ship or an instruction vessel or just a hulk, accommodation hulk by the late 1870s, early 1880s. Because if you ultimately want a short-range coast defence ship armed with 12-inch guns, there are better and more efficient ways of going about it. Apart from enlarging the Cerberus design might give you that. Or, Devastation and Thunderer. And Devastation and Thunderer, of course, are far more seaworthy and longer range. Imprison Grover Fur asks, during the period the Channel covers, did the Royal Navy have any form of official or unofficial racial segregation the way that the US Navy did? And how did the Royal Navy handle sailors who were found to be gay, etc., 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 whatever the new acronym is these days, both in terms of official policy and what was done in practice? So for the first part of the question, that's somewhat related to a question answered in a recent Drydock about Royal Navy officers who were black, or as the term was back then, coloured, and still is in some parts of the world for that matter. Now, the Royal Navy in particular has a little bit of a weird history in this. In the Age of Sail, again, as I covered in a previous question in previous Drydock, the Royal Navy didn't really care that much what colour you were, as long as you did your job. There were other things which would tend to prevent a person who was not white from advancing to the rank of officer, or becoming an officer, period, but those were not inherent to the fact that they had a different colour skin. It was more inherent to social class, patronage, etc., etc., stuff that barred a good chunk of the local population of the UK from becoming officers as well. And you can see that in even the mid to late 1700s, black Royal Navy sailors who had been either aged out or badly affected by injuries were accepted as pensioners, i.e. given accommodation and a small stipend, alongside their white and other coloured crew mates without much fuss. The general feeling seems to be, but they're sailors who served in the Royal Navy, they did their job, and now we have to take care of them the same as anyone else. And in actual fact, a lot of the time in the Age of Sail Royal Navy, ethnicity wasn't even recorded. So tracing who everybody was basically depends on the few people for whom that actually mattered, and they bothered to record it. Most of the time, people just like name, rank, capabilities, great, on the ship you go. Now, the reason I say the Royal Navy has a slightly weird history with this is that the Royal Navy does have a period of segregation. In fact, they have a period where they don't even allow people who aren't white to enlist, whether you be black or multiracial or whatever the politically acceptable term for that is these days. I mean, as you probably know, I'm half English, half Bolivian. I genuinely don't care what descriptor you use for someone who is half one thing, half the other. But anyway, so what happened there was that in the late 1900s, going on into the very early 1910s, specifically 1911, there were actually a number of newspaper articles where they were saying, look, there's a lot of impoverished former sailors, and a good majority of these are non-white of various descriptions. But then a bunch of unions and some political activists got together and they were just like, well, clearly the easiest way to solve all this is to just bar non-white people from serving in the armed forces entirely. Obviously, the Royal Navy in particular, in the case of our discussion. And then that would afford, again quoting their words, that would afford the opportunity for patriotic white British sailors to serve in the Royal Navy, an opportunity that if a black person was taking their spot, they would be denied. Yeah, okay, whatever. Now, this, what they called colour bar, was not entirely enforced across the Navy during World War I and the interwar period, and then gets officially lifted at the start of World War II. It's still somewhat in practice even towards the end of World War II, at least in terms of perception rather than officialdom. And then it kind of gradually gets extracted out of the Royal Navy as the next decade or so goes on. But it is a rather weird situation in that if you were a black citizen of the British Empire, you would actually have far more equality and a far better chance of serving in the Royal Navy in the 19th century than you would in the early 20th century. Now, as far as the, let's call it the rainbow acronym section of society, how did the Royal Navy handle that kind of sailor? Well, for the most part, obviously it depends on the time period that you're talking about, because in the time period the channel covers, it was pretty much criminal offence. How much of a criminal offence, i.e. basically how much you'd get punished, depended very much on the time period. Obviously, the further back you go, the punishments tend to be harsher and harsher. But generally speaking, if you were found out, you would be dismissed from service. If you were found out actively participating in such things, then certainly in the age of sail, you could be flogged or similar. But at the same time, as with a number of other things in the Royal Navy, like, people who are functional alcoholics and so forth, there was a certain element of, as long as you're not dumb enough to get caught, people aren't going to poke and prod all that much, unless you happen to have a particularly nosy set of shipmates. And there certainly, at least by the early 20th century, and to a certain extent even in the 19th century, seems to have been a certain amount of, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, just don't say anything going on. Because, well, when you look at the plays and such that the Royal Navy ships would put on, obviously on a ship that's entirely crewed by men, playing the female parts could pose a little bit of an issue, unless you have someone who's very, very good at being effeminate and dressing up as a lady. And, well, there are some photos of those kinds of plays where certain sailors were exceptionally, perhaps you might even say suspiciously good at playing the female roles, and seemed to recur in those roles quite a bit, while other sailors would perhaps be put off from participating in that side of the play or stage show or whatever. But people tended to just kind of ignore any potential implications of that, at least as much as they could. Although, of course, that kind of situation would swing a bit like a pendulum depending on the general level of politically and publicly socially enforced morality that was present at any given time. Nathan Redder asks, why were intensive inter-service rivalries allowed to play out during wartime? I understand peacetime bickering over budget and resources, but during wartime the literal existence of your nation is at stake. You've even pointed out quote-unquote friendly fire incidents, and one branch flat out refusing to assist another branch. How are these people unable to set aside their egos during a war? Why did the heads of these nations allow this, and has this been a common theme throughout history, or more of a modern issue? There's a very wide mixture of factors, and a lot of it depends on which particular inter-service rivalry you're looking at. So, for example, when you're looking at Japan, with the Japanese army versus the Japanese navy, the military is a good chunk of the political process. So politicians aren't really going to be able to turn around and tell the two sides to knock it off, because most of the politicians don't want to, because most of the politicians either are part of or have strong allegiances to one or the other faction. Plus, of course, when you're talking about the Japanese level of inter-service rivalry, you're also talking about assassinations. So do you want to keep your head or not? Try telling both sides to knock it off. That's one way to a war widow's pension going the way of your spouse. A more simple factor is that just because people have opened up the taps on spending in wartime, it doesn't mean there's unlimited resources. It just means there's more resources than there was in peacetime. So there's still going to be a finite amount of money, a finite amount of steel, a finite amount of skilled workers, a finite amount of factory floor space, etc., etc. And if either both Army and Navy, or Army, Navy and Air Force in latter conflicts, all want as much of that resource expenditure as they can possibly get hold of, even in a country like World War II America, the US, there are still going to be areas where both parties are demanding something of the same thing, and thus there's going to be a fight over who gets it. And that's just inevitable. I mean, a good example of that would be whether or not the Fleet Air Arm gets a properly navalized Spitfire variant in 1939-1940, as opposed to the breaks every third time it lands Seafire variants of the latter stages of the war. And that comes down to, as far as the RAF is concerned, they believe that Supermarine and various subsidiary factories can only produce so many Spitfire or Spitfire variant airframes per month, and they want more than the total production output. And even before it comes down to airframes, it's also Rolls-Royce's ability to produce the Merlin engine. So initially the RAF says, no, we need every Merlin engine we can get, because bear in mind the Merlin is being stuck not just in the Spitfire, it's being stuck in the Hurricane, it's being stuck in various projected bombers, it's being stuck in light bombers, all sorts of things are using the Merlin. And then when the Fleet Air Arm says, okay, fine, we'll have a Spitfire-based airframe, but we'll use some other kind of engine from another manufacturer, then the RAF turns around and says, as I said earlier, that they think that Supermarine is going to be fully booked out with producing Spitfire airframes for the RAF. And their argument essentially goes that right now they need to defend the UK, the homeland as it were, and also there are other manufacturers who can produce other airframes. Yeah, they may not be as good, but, well, the RAF has more money to swing in terms of aeronautics, and therefore they should get first dibs. And that's why the Fleet Air Arm has to kind of work its way through all sorts of stopgaps until pretty much 44-45 when it comes to fighters. There's also some people who believe they're looking to the future, because obviously in both World War I and World War II, no one actually thinks the war is going to last 4-ish years and 6-ish years respectively. They think it's going to last 1 or 2 years, and so some of the department and service heads are looking at the situation from a perspective of, well, we can't let insert other rival service here get a leg up on us during this brief period of bounty in terms of money and resources, because then that might allow them to position themselves as the primary arm of the military subsequent to the war, and that will be long-term net negative for our service, so we're going to have to fight them all the way. And sometimes it is just ego, people being incredibly short-sighted about things, which is unfortunately a very common human failing, and perhaps more so during wartime, because when wartime comes, you have to call people up out of the reserves, you have to draft people in, services balloon to ridiculous degrees, and so does the bureaucracy. And so while in theory you might have, say, an admiral of the fleet and the chief air marshal and the supreme general of the army or field marshal or whatever all cooperating, 16 layers of chain of command down, you might have some guy who hasn't actually been in active service for 10 years, has been called back to the colours, is serving in a relatively minor appearing but actually fairly critical bureaucratic position, and his mindset is still set on what he knew 10 years ago, which is, down with everyone who isn't my service. Although I would say these rivalries are more exacerbated in the early 20th century than they are historically, partly because, of course, you get the introduction of a third service, the Air Force, or whatever various nations want to call it. And even if you don't have an independent Air Force in a given conflict, you still have aerial resources, aircraft manufacture, etc., which have certain commonalities across the board. And of course, because air support is just as vital at sea as it is on land, as it is as an independent thing, it means there's actually more grounds for conflict, even if you just have an army and a navy still around. Whereas historically, while there were plenty of rivalries between armies and navies, the fact that neither can exist really all that much in the other's domain mostly put a stop to it, except for things that cross over, like who gets command of coastal artillery and so forth. Steam Mean Fighting Machine asks, the US Navy first experimented with deck-edge elevators on USS Wasp. These deck-edge elevators were, as far as I can tell, superior to the centerline elevators previously used on US carriers in just about every way. Despite this, both the Essex and Midway classes retained centerline elevators. My question is, why? I don't see any advantage in retaining the centerline elevators, and it's not like they didn't have time to incorporate them into the design, since they did have at least one deck-edge elevator as built. The reason comes down to a few of the inherent disadvantages of a deck-edge elevator, at least at the time of these carriers being designed and the way the hulls were laid out. Firstly, a deck-edge elevator, for the most part, was somewhat smaller. Obviously, Wasp has a very, very small one. It's essentially just a platform with an outrigger, but even with the Essexes and Midways, generally speaking, you could only fit one aircraft on the deck-edge elevator, whereas assuming you had aircraft with folding wings, you could usually get at least two on the centerline elevators because they were much larger, and commensurate with that, the centerline elevators were also capable of carrying much greater weights, so you could actually lift two fully loaded aircraft for the most part, unless you're talking about some of the really, really heavy versions of the Avenger, on a centerline elevator, whereas on a deck-edge elevator, you would only ever get the one. And in fact, even during the Cold War, the upgrades to the Essex class's deck-edge elevator, while it increased the overall poundage up to 30,000 pounds that it could lift, that still was actually somewhat short of the initial lift capacity of the centerline elevators. So, again, assuming you're using folding wing aircraft, if you use a deck-edge elevator and two centerline elevators, you can lift 5 aircraft at a time, whereas if you just use 3 deck-edge elevators, you can only lift 3 aircraft at a time, which obviously limits how fast you can actually handle the aircraft coming up and down. Another factor is speed of handling. Now, while the deck-edge elevator does allow for cleaner handling because it doesn't interfere with your flight line or your hangar deck, the simple fact is that when the centerline elevator is down, you just roll aircraft from where they're parked straight onto them and up it goes, and likewise, it's relatively easy to roll an aircraft that's just landed onto an centerline elevator and send it down, whereas with a deck-edge elevator, you have to turn the thing at least 90 degrees, maybe even 270 degrees. You might have to back it onto the thing, and then you're going to have to pull it off at the top. That bit's not so hard, but then you've got to repeat the whole process of which way round does it go, turning it 90 degrees off the flight line, etc., if you're trying to send an aircraft down. There were also concerns about the weather, particularly in rough weather. It would be possible to use a centerline elevator in seas where a deck-edge elevator either was in and of itself non-practical or would open up the side of the ship to water and thus make the whole exercise non-practical. And finally, there was also concern about damage, because while, of course, a bomb hit directly on or near a centerline elevator could render it inoperable, a near miss, whether by bomb or shell or enemy aircraft or whatever, is extremely unlikely to affect the running of a centerline elevator, whereas all sorts of blast and shrapnel effects from near misses could very well jam a deck-edge elevator if those explosions happen in vague proximity to it, and perhaps even the same with certain torpedo impacts. And so there were a number of reasons, while not necessarily ruling out deck-edge elevators, because they did have a whole load of advantages as well. At the time, it was felt, well, if we have both, we can get the advantages of both without having to inherit the full disadvantages of either. Class A Cornate asks, you're called upon to fix the design of the Flottenbeglieter. How? First of all, just acknowledge that it's going to be physically impossible to tick every single box demanded of it all in one go. And secondly, for the love of all that's good, do not use an entire class as a prototype for an extremely high-power finicky engine. Yes, I can understand using a small ship as a prototype for an engine that you want to install on your big destroyers, but that's why you have a test bed. Use maybe one ship of the class and then run the rest with normal, more conventional engines in order to get a side-by-side comparison. So with that said, they want a fast, long-range fleet escort that can maybe do a little bit of anti-aircraft work, but is also supposed to be a good anti-submarine and anti-minesweeping platform. That is not a comparable skill set. So the way I would look at it is Split the class into two. And if you really, really want economy, then actually use a common hull design as a starting point. So design a fairly large deep ocean escort. So escort will concentrate primarily on anti-aircraft and anti-submarine warfare combined with long-distance operations. And that will have a diesel power plant for long range. Now, yes, I'm not necessarily going to get the absolute top speed of a destroyer or anything out of it, but generally speaking, I'm not going to need 34 knots or so. 28 knots should be fine if I can get that out of a diesel power plant. And if I can't, then even in the mid-20s, that I'm still going to be fast enough to keep up with the ships I'm trying to escort at their general cruising speed. And yes, if they have to go sprinting off because of some capital ship engagement or other, they may well outrun me. But honestly, at that point, I shouldn't be there in the first place. I can break off and try and meet up later on. So that would be my longer range vessel. And then I would have a shorter range version, which is designed again for anti-submarine warfare, but with more emphasis on the minesweeping element of things. And for this is why you have two versions of the hull. You could have a shorter version of the hull. So yes, it's a little more dumpy, a little bit more Flower-Glass Corvette-like, but that's fine because this version is not supposed to go particularly quick, low 20s at most of knots, and it doesn't have to be particularly long range either. And because it's going to be massing a lot less, also it's going to hopefully have a slightly shallower draft. And for this, I can use pretty much any power plant I have to hand. And so this class will be my kind of coastal escort generally, but specifically for fleet options, it's a kind of fast minesweeper, as far as minesweepers are concerned at least. And then you would sail with both classes initially, and then the coastal variant, which will initially be ahead doing minesweeping and the initial bit of the anti-submarine work. Once you get out into deeper water, then that peels off and goes home, and then the deeper, longer range escort version stays with the ship as it heads off into the sunset, while my coastal version can run escort for convoys and all sorts of other things as well. Texas and LaShock asks, in Drydock 362 you showed an intelligence image of Taiho, but in the corner it says CV-10. Why is that up there when they're not talking about the Essex-class Yorktown? That's because under the ONI designations, where they'd classified all the various Japanese ships, and indeed everybody's ships, for easy recognition by US Navy personnel, they'd given everything US-style hull designations, I guess, to help with ordering things. So, for example, the Congo class were labelled BB1 through BB4, Fuso and Yamashiro were 5 and 6, the Iseis were 7 and 8, and Nagato and Mutsu were 9 and 10, Yamato Musashi 11 and 12, and for aircraft carriers, according to the US classification, CV1 was Akagi, 2 was Kaga, 3 was Rujo, 4 was Soryu, 5 was Hiryu, 6 was Shokaku, 7 was Zuikaku, 8 was Hayataka, or actually Junyo, 9 was Hitaka, which actually Hiyo, and CV10 was Taiho. And in case you're interested, Hosho, along with Zuiho, Shoho, etc., they were all counted as CVLs. And the same thing I said was carried through for cruisers. Furutaka, for example, led the CA designation, the Tenryus led the CL designation, and so on and so forth. Brian Stevens asks, who would you say is your favourite ship's commander? We often talk about famous admirals, but specific commanders such as Ernest Evans are fascinating in their histories. I mean, that's a slot that varies quite often in my mind, usually depending on whose biography I've read most recently. But a perennial candidate for top favourite ship's commander would probably have to be Thomas Cochrane during his period when he was a lowly ship's commander or captain, mostly because he seems to have fully embraced the utterly mad ideas of the most lunatic of the Royal Navy's commanders. Much as you have the reputation of the tribal class destroyer commanders in World War II, and the 10th Destroyer Flotilla in particular as being, something of an asylum afloat, Pellew, who's another very, very good ship commander, I would say he's definitely tribal commander material. Cochrane is commander of 10th Destroyer Flotilla material. He comes up with each and every possible madcap escapade you can possibly think of, and a few beside. the whole thing about reality is stranger than fiction. You look through his list of escapades and you realize very quickly that should someone try to do a mini-series of his life in, let's say, the Napoleonic Wars period, you would have to carry a disclaimer, not this is based on true realistic events. You would have to carry a disclaimer at the front of, these events actually happened, no, we're not making it up, because otherwise people would accuse you of embellishing some of the stuff he got up to. Brian Smith asks, were there any naval battles that had different names depending on the country, like some land battles have different names depending on the side during wartime? Plenty of naval battles are in that kind of categorization. Sometimes it's because one side chooses to give the battle a superlative or a nominative that breaks from traditional naval battle naming tradition, which is to name it after the closest point of land. And sometimes it's also a case of a disagreement over what was the closest point of land, because on the scale of major fleet combat, you can end up in situations where at the time when battle is about to be commenced, one navy might look around and go, well, that is the closest point of land to us, therefore it is the battle of this. The other navy, who might be 10, 15, 20 miles away, might be going, actually, the closest point of land to us is this, therefore it's the battle of this other thing instead. And that gets baked in pretty quickly. And of course, not every navy follows the tradition of naming a battle after the nearest point of land. Or they might have different names for the same point of land. So you will find that unless somebody is trying to do a very common naming system or an international naming system, quite a few battles will have different names. Jutland is a very, very good example of that, because Jutland is, of course, known as the Battle of Jutland in the English-speaking world, but it's known as the Battle of the Skagerrak in the German-speaking world, at least officially. Seb Dove asks, I appreciate this is slightly on the darker side of things, but how much more catastrophic would the Pacific War have been for the United States if the Japanese had embraced kamikaze tactics as doctrine, with it being an integral part of their use of carriers, and employed them from the beginning of the war? Potentially, it could have been much, much worse for multiple reasons. Firstly, if the Japanese know that a percentage of their pilots are not supposed to be coming back, then, well, there's not as much need to put them through the huge amounts of training that they historically did. So you'd end up with two categories of pilots. You get the pilots who are actually supposed to be flying multiple missions, and the pilots who are supposed to be flying one-way missions. And because you can churn out those one-way pilots a lot faster, the Japanese might actually be able to maintain the size of their air groups, as weird as that sounds, because if they're only producing so many elite pilots per year, but those are getting attrition somewhat less because a good chunk of the attrition is being taken up by the kamikazes, their pilot depreciation will be slower, at least in overall terms. Obviously, pilot depreciation per battle will be very high. Another thing is, if they're embracing it as doctrine, presumably even from pre-war, one would presume there might be some form of specialist kamikaze aircraft developed, which might make sacrifices in armament and so forth in exchange for speed and payload. And the big killer factor, I think, is the fact that, of course, at the beginning of the war, the US has far fewer ships in general, carriers in particular, and they have less anti-aircraft armament aboard and less effective anti-aircraft armament aboard. In some ways, the kamikazes being used in late 44 and onwards were the worst time to use them, because then you have VT fuses, you have huge numbers of 20mm and 40mm guns everywhere, and thus the ability to take down incoming kamikazes, not to mention, of course, very large combat air patrols, is very much in place. Whereas at the start of the war, where you've got very poor fighter direction, relatively small combat air patrols, and once you get past non-proximity fuse 5-inch barrages, the best that you've got to put up against these incoming aircraft is going to be a scattering of Browning 50 cals and a few 1.1-inch Chicago pianos. A lot more of these kamikazes are going to get through, and they have, as I said, proportionally fewer targets. Therefore, losses to the US Navy, even if it's not ships sunk, even if you're just talking in terms of ships badly damaged needing to go back for repairs, is going to be much, much higher. And there's only so quickly you can adapt to those kind of tactics. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much, everybody, for listening and watching, and I hope to see you again in another video soon. Bye for now.